It is in moments of crisis that leadership makes the biggest difference to human thriving and organizational performance. The purpose of this curated set of videos is to offer you 4 best practices in crisis leadership. These are the 4 elements of crisis leadership that I think could make the biggest difference for you, for your team, and for your organization in the current crisis. We could understand these elements of crisis leadership using this framework. The first responsibility of leaders in a crisis is to articulate a crisis strategy. What are the priorities for success for the team or organization during the crisis? We'll give you elements about what's necessary in a crisis leadership, and we'll give you examples and some tools for producing your own. We're going to go next to talk about leading yourself in a crisis. Here, I'm going to offer you a tool. It's a way to access your own values, and we find that leaders who can access their values in a crisis are more present, they operate with more authenticity, they generate trust in the people they're leading, they make more ethical decisions, they manage stress more effectively, and they make choices which are ultimately more compelling. After we introduce that tool for leading yourself, we'll go on to leading others during the crisis. And here, we're going to describe a situation we call optimal anxiety. The idea here is that you want the people you're leading to feel some pressure as the crisis moment demands. You want them to be compelled to act, to be highly motivated. But at the same time, you don't want them to be overwhelmed by the moment. You don't want them to descend into stress and despair. We'll give you examples and practices for achieving this balance. The final best practice you can think about as a way to bring the others together. It's really a leadership message, a message that explains what you stand for as a leader in the crisis, the strategy, how the organization is going to succeed, and how the people you're leading can operate at their best. We're going to give you a recipe for this crisis leadership message, and we're going to give you some examples for leaders who've put this recipe to good use. Now, to support these best practices, I'm also going to offer you some material from Columbia's curriculum on crisis leadership, specifically a case study we call Operation Tomodachi. This case, represented by videos, follows the crisis leadership of a Columbia Business School alum, Captain Matt Feely, who was, during the 2011 Japanese earthquake and tsunami, the commanding officer of the U.S. Navy's Fleet Logistics Center, Yokosuka. Captain Feely's organization does supply and logistics for the Pacific Fleet. So it was really at the heart of the U.S. military's humanitarian and relief effort. We're going to get the chance to see some of the challenges that Captain Feely faced in the crisis and some of his ways to overcome those challenges. The idea here, of course, is to advise us to be better crisis leaders in this moment. So what we're going to do is intersplice segments of Operation Tomodachi with advice from me on how we can take some of those lessons and put them to work in the current moment ourselves as leaders in crisis. So I invite you to watch the first segment of Operation Tomodachi. It's called The Earthquake, and it introduces the situation. After that, I'll be back to give some advice on how you can be effective as a strategist in a crisis.
On March 11th, 2011, it was a Friday afternoon, just a few hours before the weekend was to start. I was in my office cleaning up some of the admin work from the previous week. At about 2:46 p.m. local time, the earthquake began. My first reaction was fear. I had been in a couple of earthquakes before, but nothing even close to that magnitude. In fact, I had worked on the Haiti response to that problem, but of course, the Haiti earthquake was about 7.1. The earthquake that we experienced was about 9.0 on the same scale, which places it at about 100 times the power in Haiti. So you can well imagine being only 240 miles south of the center of that quake really rocked our building, quite literally. The corners of the office in which I did my work were not at right angles. So you can imagine that the anxiety and the fear started immediately. And the first notion that I had was the importance to just preserve life locally. It was that severe. Within an hour and a half of the initial earthquake, we received our first request for assistance from the local government of Yokosuka, asking for fuel when their fuel tanks spilled to make sure that they could continue to run their sanitation plants. Immediately after that, I assembled my immediate team within the headquarters of my most senior specialists, and we began to recognize that we probably would be called upon to provide logistics support, not necessarily for humanitarian assistance or disaster relief. We had offices in the northern part of Japan, very close to the center of the earthquake and to the area that was prone to the later tsunami. And so we were very concerned about the well-being of our people. The first hour and a half, 2 hours or so after the earthquake, once we were able to safely reoccupy our offices, we spent making sure that we had a count of all of our personnel. There was very little information available to us about the effects that the earthquake itself and then later the tsunami had in the area that was most deeply affected by those events. Once we did the best that we could to account for all of our personnel, approximately 2.5 hours after the earthquake itself, I did send an email to the commander of Fleet Logistics in San Diego. The email that I sent to the commander was essentially an update explaining what the situation on the ground was as well as we could understand it, essentially summarized for that admiral what the physical condition was of our capital, our human capital, as well as our real capital. I knew very quickly that we had a communications problem because the rumor was that all of Japan was having a communications problem, and when I tried to communicate, tried to contact our command elements in the Tohoku region of Japan, which received the brunt of the damage from the earthquake and the subsequent tsunami, we were unable to get in touch with those people. As a matter of course, copied on the email updates that I sent to the commander of Fleet Logistics Centers in San Diego, I copied all of my functional and regional commanders so they would all understand the conditions on ground as much as we understood them.
Consider the position of Captain Feely's organization at the end of that short video. Japan has been visited by a massive natural disaster. The Japanese people will need assistance and relief, but it is unclear yet what those needs will be. His own organization has been affected, but the communication does not allow him to understand how the people under his command have been impacted by the earthquake and tsunami. Nevertheless, he has to quickly organize his activity and direct the resources within his organization towards a positive end. This is a great example of the need in a crisis for clarity around strategy. What the strategy does is reminds everybody in an organization what the collective purpose is, what the end they're pursuing is, and what are the most significant priorities for achieving that end. The role it plays is it allows people in different corners of the organization to make decisions that will be aligned with each other, so they'll be pulling in the same direction as opposed to canceling each other out. Just think about this. In the situation of Operation Tomodachi, the only members of Matt's organization who had eyes on the ground were young helicopter pilots. They were the only people who were really in contact with the Japanese people in the affected region that were the subject of the organization's humanitarian efforts. Matt and his team, separated by physical space, lacking communication, were in no position to provide supervision in any sense of those helicopter pilots. Those pilots who were closest to the action would have to make decisions in a distributed fashion, and ideally you would like those decisions to be moving the organization in an aligned way towards a collective goal. Right? So for that to happen, people in the organization have to know what they're trying to achieve collectively and what are the key priorities for getting there. It's also true that employees are more engaged and motivated when they know those priorities. You can get confused and turned around in the middle of a crisis. So it's all the more important to remind people what is most significant in terms of their work. So what this means for you is that if you haven't done it already, you should be articulating for the people you lead a crisis strategy. The elements of this are a reminder about what you're trying to achieve, what your goal, what your mission of your organization is, and a concise set of priorities, I would say 4 or 5, no more than that, in order of importance about what is most significant for achieving the shared end. Here's an example I came across recently that I thought was actually quite good. This comes from a K through 12 school shut down in the crisis, and this is the communication I saw from their leadership team to all constituents of the organization about how they were going to succeed in the crisis. First of all, what was the shared goal? Their goal was to keep learning. That was their mission. And then they were very clear about what the priorities were, including order. The first thing they knew they had to do was they had to fit and adjust their curriculum to the constraints of online education. One of the things they did in response to that challenge was to shorten their days. They thought after that first priority, the second was to help students maintain relationships. This is hearkening back to that organization's strategy in times that don't involve crisis. They're an organization, a school that pursues learning through relationships, and here they've decided this is as important in the crisis. Their third priority was to provide support for families within their constituents that may have been affected by the crisis. And finally, to help teachers, and they also articulated what that meant. That meant extending patience and empathy in this time where flexibility is required, right? So these are the key elements you need. What are you trying to achieve as an organization? What are the mission, and what are the small set of priorities for achieving it? Now, let me offer you a tool that might be useful as you generate priorities for your organization in crisis. This is a tool that we use for strategizing in calmer moments, but I want to suggest at the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis, which I think many observers are suggesting could go on, certainly for months and maybe into years, there's still a number of uncertainties. So ideally, your crisis strategy would be one which is robust to various manifestations of the world as yet unknown. Here's one way to develop such a strategy. It's called scenario planning. This is actually some representation of a scenario planning exercise I did with the top management team in an organization at the very beginning stages of the COVID-19 crisis. So the first effort is to decide for your organization, what are the most significant, what are the 2 most significant dimensions of uncertainty in the current crisis? So my work with the top management team, we decided the dimensions of uncertainty were the extent of the health crisis. Would it be global, long, intense, persistent, or would it be local, punctuated, such that you might get flare-ups of a contagion, an infection in a country, but they might die down in a few weeks and they might be more episodic. And then for that organization, we also thought about uncertainty in financial markets. Were financial markets going to suffer their own contagion? Was there going to be a kind of potential seizing of debt markets? Was there going to be a deep, persistent fall in equity markets? Or were financial markets going to be more stable throughout the crisis? You decide what the dimensions for your own organization are, but your first step is to come up with 2 dimensions. You could represent them on a 2x2 matrix like this. Next, in scenario planning, we find it's useful to provide a narrative, a little bit of qualitative description for what life is like under each intersection of your 2 dimensions of uncertainty. I've done that here, or shown you at least what we did with the top management team I was working with. And then your job is to come up with opportunities and threats and ideal priorities for your organization under each of these 4 potential states of the world. The opportunity here, what you might get from this exercise, is you could recognize that there are some priorities that would be priorities regardless of how the world turns out, or at least in 2 or 3 of the potential states that you anticipate. So if you have priorities that are robust to uncertainty, that's a very good signal that they're candidates for being at the heart of your crisis leadership strategy. So the message here through the scenario planning example is to realize that we don't know exactly how this crisis or any crisis is going to unfold. And if you can anticipate some of the major dimensions of uncertainty and think a little bit about what would matter for your organization under various contingencies, you've got the opportunity to produce a strategy that could be more robust to the present uncertainty. So what is your job? Your job is to articulate a crisis strategy. Tell the people you lead, remind them what is the mission of the organization, what is it that you are trying to achieve. Offer them a concise set, no more than 5 priorities in order. What are the most important things that the organization has to achieve at the moment of crisis? Now, as we return to the second episode in the Operation Tomodachi video, let me tell you a little bit about how Captain Feely put this to work. One of the first things he did is he called on his own knowledge when he heard about the earthquake of the sources of human tragedy, of death in a natural disaster. And he knew from his own research that there were 8 sources of death that are most likely in a situation like the one that Japan faced. But he realized quickly that there were 2 of them, being too cold or too thirsty, that were most significant for the people affected by the earthquake and tsunami. So he immediately directed his organization, the supply chains, the eyes on the ground and those helicopter pilots, to trying to address those needs, thirst and cold. And as a function of that choice, of that prioritization, avoided wasting effort on, for example, getting and delivering other kinds of supplies that would not have been as important and made as much of a difference in that circumstance. To be effective, you have to prioritize, and the people in your organization need to know the priorities. Let's return now to Operation Tomodachi and see a little bit more of the challenges the captain faced as the situation unfolded.
As you might imagine, the fact that we were unable to retain normal communications with my regional and functional commanders, essentially largely my regional commanders, presented a bit of a dilemma for us. But U.S. Navy units take pride in our ability to provide services independently, and so I had confidence that while I was unable to maintain the normal communications with the organization there, I had every sense of confidence that the regional commander there would make the right choices to not only protect personnel, but to continue to be able to deliver services from that locality if in fact it were physically possible to do so. When the earthquake occurred on Friday, Yokosuka time, Japan time, of course it was late at night or early in the morning in the US on a late Thursday night or early Friday morning. And there really wasn't, because of the communication problems from Japan, very little understanding of the magnitude of the problems that we were facing at the time in the United States. Thus, I received, in essence, no inquiries other than just notes of appreciation for the very thorough 3 or 4 times a day communiques that I had sent out to my chain of command. All that changed on late Monday, the 14th, when an admiral from the Navy Pacific Fleet staff called me to suggest that I consider stopping the work that I was doing to provide humanitarian assistance, disaster relief. I recognized that his suggestion was probably based upon the concern that he had that I might be subject to prosecution for breaking the Anti-Deficiency Act, which is a law, a federal statute that is intended to assure, and it forbids essentially, federal officers, employees of the federal government, from allocating or committing federal funds before those funds are appropriated through congressional action. There is a method that we utilize to cover contingencies like this, and it's the requirement generation process, whereby if a request for assistance were to, in the case of Japan, originate with a local on-scene entity on the ground in Japan somewhere, and if that request were vetted through the local Japanese government, all the way up through the provincial Japanese government or the prefectural government, all the way to the federal government of Japan, and then Japan requested American assistance to provide that request. That request would be considered at the highest levels of the American government, in essence the Department of State, and then perhaps if Department of Defense were the most capable entity to provide that assistance, that request would be given to the Secretary of Defense. The Secretary of Defense, through consultations, would decide whether that request to be considered formally a requirement. Once it is considered a requirement, that requirement would be deemed through this statute to have appropriated funds backing it up. The problem was that the exigency of the situation required action that needed to be delivered very quickly, much more quickly than the requirements generation process allowed for. And as a result, I received lots and lots of requests for assistance, but no formal, no approved requirements. And thus, by perhaps at least a very conservative interpretation of the Anti-Deficiency Act, in some sense, I was breaking the law by providing humanitarian assistance and disaster relief to the people of Japan without the requirement.
So at the end of that segment, think about the dilemma that Captain Feely is facing. It is literally between following the letter of the law and saving lives. How did he resolve that dilemma? Well, actually, when it comes to my classes on crisis leadership to talk about this case, it's actually a very dramatic moment where he talks about the resolution of this challenge. It's at this point in this discussion with Columbia students that he goes to his wallet and he takes from his wallet a laminated card. He actually received it some 10, 12 years ago in my class that represents his values hierarchy. That's a representation of a leader's top values in order of significance. As an illustration about what a values hierarchy looks like, this is actually my own values hierarchy. And of course, Captain Feely's has his own values and his own connections between them. But this is what he consulted when he was faced with that life and law dilemma. In fact, it's now the case that every executive MBA and MBA student at the Columbia Business School leaves with a values hierarchy, and we give it to them on a laminated card. So they've got the opportunity to consult it and have it available at a moment like a crisis. Now, some of you may have your own values hierarchies handy. But if you don't, I would like to offer you a quick tool you could do in a few minutes that I think could help you access your values for some of the challenges you may face in the upcoming crisis. Really, it is a reflection, and it's a chance to think about what some of your most active and relevant values are at the moment of the crisis, for the purpose of keeping them top of mind. Right? So I'll show you how this works. Take a moment to do a reflection like this. I'm not going to give you time on this video, but you can come back and do it. What I'd like you to think about is, in the crisis as you face it in your organization and what's going on around you, reflect about the challenges and opportunities it represents. What is most important to you? So what do the crisis represents? What, in terms of what's at stake, is most important to you? And so if I was going to answer that most important question for myself, I think I would say family. That would be my first answer. And then the reflection asks you to go on. What's next? For me, as I think about the current crisis, I think about creativity. That would probably be my second answer. My third would be opportunity. You'll go back and do this for yourself. And as you do this, write down those values and then come up with a way to represent them. Perhaps they could be on your phone or something you might carry with you in a written form, in your daily planner, for example, or a sign on the whiteboard in your office to keep them top of mind in the crisis. Now, why would it matter if your values are top of mind in the crisis? Well, let's go back here to Captain Feely. And let me tell you about the decision he made at this pivotal moment in Operation Tomodachi. When he consulted his values hierarchy, he saw that his top value was love. And the value love, as you might imagine, led him to choose life and the continuing provision of humanitarian aid and relief over following the letter of the law. Right? But he had this clarity immediately when he thought about how his values manifest themselves in the dilemma he was facing. Now, making good choices is not the only way that values help in a crisis. We actually have good experimental evidence that leaders who have their values top of mind enjoy 4 other benefits that matter significantly in a crisis. The first is they deal better with stress. Actually, bringing your values to the top of mind lowers cortisol, which is the stress hormone and is associated with physical breakdown over time. Right? So knowing your values helps you deal with stress. There's also compelling evidence that when somebody has their values top of mind, they have more confidence, and actually they respond more effectively when they're threatened. So dealing with threat in a confident way, of course, very relevant in a crisis. We find that leaders who know their values are more ethical. And in the complexity of a crisis, you could very well have your ethics challenged. And the fourth benefit that we find from knowing your values is that if the leader has his or her values top of mind, others view the leader as more authentic and trustworthy. So in other words, the people you're leading find you more worthy of the position of leadership if you know your values, right? So the tool for you is to identify your values, go back on this video, spend a minute or two with that reflection, elucidate for yourself, distill your top values, keep them handy, accessible, remind yourself in the crisis. It would help you make choices, deal with stress, deal with threat, be ethical, and be viewed by others as more authentic. Now, let's go to Operation Tomodachi again and look at the next challenge that Captain Feely deals with. This is to do with leading his workforce.
You might well imagine that I was very concerned about the response that the Japanese workforce might have to the realization that their countrymen had just suffered a very severe earthquake, the follow-on tsunami, and then of course the worries that accompanied the Fukushima Daiichi power plant problem. And so I paid particular attention to the Japanese workforce, as I understood that our workforce would either have known somebody or known someone who knew somebody in the Tohoku region who would be directly affected. Interestingly, I saw no evidence at all of a reduction in productivity. And of course, the Japanese culture tends to, at least from our perspective, appear to be quite stoic. And so I saw no very obvious change in attitude or disposition, but I thought that I had perhaps witnessed higher levels of anxiety, which for reasons I've already elucidated would be quite understandable. And so to investigate a little further, I decided that I would take the time to meet with small groups of the master labor contract, i.e. the Japanese workforce, over the course of the next 3 days. I met with groups that varied between approximately 5 and maybe 20 members of the workforce, and spent quite a few hours each of 3 days doing just that. And when I met with the workforce, I was observing their behavior and trying to discern whether they might have a notable and alarming level of anxiety, and at the same time tried to assure them that America was quite sympathetic to their plight. And I emphasized that, in fact, we felt sorry for their troubles. The sympathy matter was perhaps less important than the other element that I tried to convey, which was that we had a sense of empathy for what they had experienced. And I think I could say that with some credibility, given our own experiences with Katrina, and then of course before that with the terrible events of 9/11. And so this wasn't lost on the Japanese workforce. They really did appreciate and understand that we were not only sympathetic, but empathetic. And I also, as I witnessed the trepidation, the anxiety levels that I was sure that they were feeling, I also sought to assure them that the country of Japan could in fact transcend this great challenge that it was facing at the time. I reminded them of their own history, and I reminded them in a way that really caught their attention, because we and they were at war merely 65 years ago. But that after the war, we were able to essentially come to a like mind and work together to lay the groundwork for Japan's own efforts to, in essence, engineer what some people might argue is the greatest economic miracle in modern history. And I wanted to make sure they understood that, because they had reason to hope. They had reason to have faith in their countrymen and in their government that they could in fact transcend this problem that was at hand.
So what we see in that segment is Captain Feely really visiting the front lines and making human contact with his Japanese workforce, checking in on their anxiety, opening up channels, rich channels of communication, expressing empathy. So this is, I think, actually one of the best examples in the case of good crisis leadership. And it is illustrative of our third best practice, which is helping the people you lead strive to achieve what we call optimal anxiety. So what is optimal anxiety? Well, it is the space between being compelled and motivated to act, but not being overcome by the challenges that you face. Part of this is achieved by the message the leader delivers. Matt was talking about the message of hope and the example to the Japanese people of how they would overcome adversity before, right? So the way I would put it in terms of messaging is that the leader will ideally represent confidence without fatalistic optimism, right? So certainly to shine a light on a brighter future and express confidence that the organization can achieve that end, but not to be laissez-faire, not to suggest that it's going to happen without action, right? So that's this kind of balance between optimism for the future, but realizing the necessity to act. I think this is actually one of the things that in the current crisis, we see not enough leaders achieving. It seems, and sometimes it's the same leaders, day to day oscillate between a kind of rosy optimism about positive outcomes or a kind of fatalistic pessimism about the dire consequences that are going to be visited on all of us. In fact, the responsibility of the leader is not to indulge either of those two extremes, to show the way to a brighter future, but to remind everybody, of course, that there is tremendous effort needed to get to that position. Next, in terms of this leading in the face of crisis, I think Captain Feely illustrates this beautifully: the human touch, empathy, listening is a great source of empathy. I'll give you an example. I saw recently of a leader in a crisis who began a communication with his complete organization by admitting that the night before he gobbled up a pint of ice cream. Now, this was a CEO who is known for his self-discipline and his health consciousness. And I know that I was smiling when I heard that admission of human frailty, and I think everybody else in the organization was. It's a kind of way of making a human connection, letting the people you're leading know that you're feeling many of the same things they do. A surprising thing perhaps about Captain Feely's leadership is that he actually left the command center in the middle of the crisis for 3 days to visit the front lines of his organization. Now that might surprise you, but I want to suggest that probably it's a good idea. First of all, why is it that sometimes people think the leader has to be in the command center? Well, they might say somebody has to be in control. Well, yes, certainly somebody has to be in control. But given the uncertainties, the complexities, the novelty around a crisis, there's no reason to expect that it has to be the leader who is always the person at the center of things, right? In fact, crises require distributed leadership, and it's quite possible and probably healthy to allow someone else with the right set of capabilities the chance to occupy a central position while the leader does something else that is important for the organization. And of course, leaving HQ and visiting the front lines sends a message of respect to the people you're leading. The next thing I want to suggest to you is that be conscious in a crisis to keep the people you're leading busy. Idleness does not give space to the most positive response in humans when they are threatened, stressed, and anxious. And so people do want to be busy. They do want to be active. Find things, productive things for them to do to occupy them towards something positive. Expressing your own values. That's something that Captain Feely actually does quite naturally. It's his own style. What we know from research is that when leaders express their own values, it's actually very motivating for the people they lead. It actually creates intrinsic motivation for the people they lead, which is the form of motivation that leads to the most satisfaction and also the best performance. And the final idea I want to offer you, I think it's another one that's relevant for the current crisis. I label this "fencing isn't fair," and that's actually a line from Columbia's champion fencing coach, Michael Offerstig. Michael does a leadership session for my students, and he teaches them this message that he also teaches his own fencing team, that they have this mantra whenever something goes wrong in a tournament or a bout, that fencing isn't fair. You know, you get a bad call against you, fencing isn't fair. Something random happens that puts you at a disadvantage, fencing isn't fair. The point of this is that if you distract yourself by thinking about the injustices of the world, or the fact that somebody else should have done something differently, or that you don't deserve to be in this difficult position you're in, you will not have the focus it takes to succeed against a intense challenge like the one represented by a crisis. Right? So there may be an opportunity for score settling after the crisis, but the crisis requires your focus. So it is not the time to think about who is to blame. It is not the time for complaints about injustice. Focus on the needs of the moment and what you can do to make things better, and really help the people you're leading do this, because their positive activity is the best protection they have against the temptation that anxiety, stress, and despair might present to them in a crisis. Now, on to the final segment of the Operation Tomodachi example. In this segment, what we're going to see is the captain faces greatest leadership challenge, and it leads up to an all-hands meeting, a message to everybody he's leading.
I was standing over my desk in my office an afternoon, reviewing the commodities flow that we needed to assist the people of Japan, and I was fairly happy with what I saw. The plan that we had was being executed, and I was certain that we were providing appropriate relief to those victims of the tsunami and before that of the earthquake. When the phone rang, and I answered the phone, and I found that it was the Chief of Staff of Logistics from the Pacific Fleet, someone who I had known for many years, and he relayed to me a question, a simple question, but that simple question had some fairly severe implications. The question was how my preparations were proceeding for sheltering in place. Well, sheltering in place essentially means ensuring that all personnel associated with the command are not exposed to the elements, that they're all hunkered down within the confines of a building. And organizations that are forward deployed or that are involved in important operations would never shelter in place, and thus never prepare to shelter in place unless there were a very, very severe exigency. I was stunned by the question, and so asked why that question was delivered to me. The tone of his voice, of his response, showed that he was equally as baffled. And therefore he explained to me that instrumentation aboard the USS George Washington, which was home ported in Yokosuka, Japan, had registered high levels of iodine-131, which is a toxic radioactive element. And as he was telling me this, I was taking notes and thus cradled the telephone between my shoulder and my left ear, and I was looking out my window upon the flight decks of the very ship, the USS George Washington, that had registered the high levels of radioactivity. Think about the quandary and the frustration that I felt receiving a warning, essentially, for the first time from several thousands of miles away in Pearl Harbor about instrumentation readings that had occurred merely 200 feet from my window. I was upset, confused, confounded, and subsequently committed to learning all I could about the radioactivity problem. Essentially, the winds that were blowing from the north to the south, from the Fukushima Daiichi power plant area to the south, must have blown the plume of radioactivity towards Yokosuka that had originated at Fukushima.
So, at the end of that segment, Captain Feely has received purported orders, the rumor of an anticipated order that all U.S. military personnel and their families are going to be evacuated from Japan. Now, this after he had spent days reassuring his Japanese workforce that the U.S. Navy, the organization, the U.S. nation would be there to support them. Imagine the position of the leader in this circumstance. He calls an all-hands meeting, the only place in the organization where all of the staff, which numbers in the thousands, I think there's 1,200 in the headquarters building, the only place they can all meet is on the rooftop of the headquarters. They assemble there, and the captain has literally minutes as he walks to the rooftop to plan the speech. In a moment, I'm going to tell you what he said to the assembled organization. But before that, I'd like to give you some guidance on how you could structure and deliver your own equivalent message in a crisis and why it's important. So this is the recipe that we offer for a crisis leadership message. And my advice to you is that you find a time, in fact, if you haven't done it already, you should be doing it soon, where you deliver a message that works for you, works in the culture of your organization, but I would expect it would have roughly these components. An explanation about what you stand for as a leader. What are your relevant values? A way to generate authenticity and connection to the people you're leading. An explanation about what the team or organization is trying to achieve. What is your mission and how you will achieve that mission. The key priorities. So you'll see here that these are really elements we've talked about in the previous best practices, your values and the crisis strategy. As I said, I'm going to tell you how Captain Feely delivered his version of this message. Before that, I'd like to give you another example. I'd like to tell you briefly about an organization that I've been working with in recent weeks, a top management team that is strategizing and interacting and trying to respond ideally to the unfolding crisis. Very recently, the leader, in fact, the whole top management team of that organization delivered an all-hands message. They assembled by phone the whole organization and delivered roughly this structure. I'll tell you a little bit about how it worked. It began with the CEO, who made a connection to values by expressing what mattered to him during this crisis. He had shared a little bit about his own personal family history that really made the situation, the crisis, meaningful to everybody. It was a great way to help everyone understand his intent and made a connection at a human level, I think, to the audience. Went on to explain the crisis strategy, reminded everybody about the mission, and explained the key priorities, what was expected of them to achieve the mission in this difficult moment. It was a collective effort. It was the whole top management team having some voice here. And in fact, one of the great elements of it is you really got the impression listening in that this was a team that was unified, that they had a plan. It would necessarily have to change and it would evolve and they need to improvise as anyone would in a crisis, but they were doing what they could to be on top of things. And so I think it made everyone in the organization feel great. I loved listening to it. And it's just one testimonial to that. This is a message, one of actually many of this kind, that the CEO received shortly after the call from an employee who said the call was really great. She said that she cried when she heard everybody's voices. It was so reassuring and normalizing. It made her proud to be part of the company. So what we're seeing here is that people need to hear from leaders and see leaders to the extent that's possible during a crisis. Presence matters. And I want to flag that the presence matters even if you don't have all of the answers. So one of the reasons leaders sometimes resist giving a message like this or calling a all-hands meeting is because the situation is unfolding. They're not in control of everything. And if they have a feeling that the leader needs to be completely in control, they might resist exposing the fact that they don't have that position. But I would suggest to you instead that you consider that nobody expects the leader to be in complete control of a complex and unfolding situation. And it is much more important if you indicate your presence and take this opportunity to connect with the people you're leading and to reassure them. Give them guidance about the strategy as well. So this brings us back to Captain Feely. What was his version of the leadership message? Well, broadly, given the situation, it followed this structure. He actually started with the second element here, reminded the people he was leading about the mission and thanked them for their efforts in pursuit of it. Went on to what they will do. In this case, he explained to them what he had heard about the rumored order to evacuate and told them that it was at this point, yes, still purported, it had not been delivered, and explained what was going to happen next, which was that he was going to learn everything he could and share all the relevant information that he could discover with them. And at that point, he actually finished with item 1 here, who he was as a leader. This is a return to values. And you will remember that Captain Feely's top value on his values hierarchy was love. And that was the message he left his organization with. He finished by saying that he loved them. He loved these 3,000 members of the military, of the Japanese civilian workforce that were assembled under his command. And he left. His speech was 2 minutes. And you can see that he did not have all of the answers, and he admitted it. But rather than use that as an excuse not to stand in front of the people he was leading, he faced up to it. He told them what he did know and what he would do in response to uncertainty. And the response he received was very much like that touching observation from the member of the organization that's going through the current crisis. Right? So your charge is to take the lessons we have had up to this point, develop your crisis leadership strategy, know your own values, remember your aspiration to help the people you're leading obtain optimal anxiety, fold it into a message, and get out there and deliver this to the people you're leading. Right? It's something, in fact, that you could do multiple times in a crisis that is protracted as the one we're currently in the middle of seems likely to be. Right? So here are the 4 best practices that I promised you from the beginning of this short session. Thank you for your engagement and my great wish and the wish from all of us at Columbia Business School is that you will be able to use some of this knowledge in your own leadership to strike more effectiveness to help yourself, the people you lead, and your organization in the current crisis. Leadership makes a difference, and it is never as true as in a crisis. There's one more segment, which is an interview between me and Captain Feely, if you'd like some concluding observations from the captain on crisis leadership. But that's the end of my set of best practices to you. We're also going to make available a link on this page to invite you to sign up to give us your name and email. If you're interested in a live webinar, kind of conversation on crisis leadership that might give you the chance to follow up, ask some questions about some of the current challenges you're facing. If we get enough interest, I'll be thrilled to engage in a synchronous activity like that. Good luck in your crisis leadership.
Let's think about another key moment in the episode, which is your speech on the rooftop, to your assembled staff. What were you thinking in terms of your hopes for that speech? What did you want to achieve?
I wanted to maintain credibility that I had established with the workforce. And I wanted to assure the workforce that the news that I had received just minutes earlier,
which was the news
that the American forces would be evacuated from Japan. This only a day after I had spent 3 days in a row meeting with all of my Japanese workforce members in small groups to assure them that we sympathized and we empathized and that I believed that together we and Japan principally, and we as adjuncts could transcend the problem that was at hand. The very next day, I went to a meeting and learned that we were being ordered to evacuate Japan. And in militaries, an evacuation is a required departure. So this was not something that we had any choice on. And so I wanted to make sure that my organization knew everything, or as close as possible to the same time that I knew, because I think that information flow is central to credibility. I also wanted to assure the workforce that I wasn't accepting of this news until I absolutely heard a reasonable logic, and I knew that the order that was purported had come from the only sources that would make it legitimate.
What were you feeling as you stepped up in front of the assembled staff?
Well, the bad feeling began as soon as I was in that high-level meeting where we had ministry-level members of the government of Japan, as well as high-level members of the U.S. government. When I learned that we were being evacuated, my stomach was turning. It was the worst day of my professional career and possibly the worst day of my life. And I've been involved in some operations that were frightening, frankly, and heartbreaking. But I felt abandoned. And I think that perhaps the workforce would feel that way when I delivered the message that I felt that I needed to deliver. The speech that I gave lasted about 1 minute, maybe slightly less, because I felt that it was inappropriate to provide anything other than what I clearly understood. I clearly understood what we were told at that meeting, and that I wouldn't give up until I found out who delivered that order to make sure it was reasonable and legitimate. And I also told them that I loved them. And I did use the term love, which is slightly unusual in a machismo military organization, but I think it was the appropriate word at the time. There was a general feeling of abandonment, I think. And so I wanted them to know that I would act in a way that reflected the love that I had felt for them.
So you've gone through that series of disasters, and even more, of course, in your role as a military officer. Did you think about this in terms of yourself? Did you feel sorry for yourself, hoisted in the position again? Were you excited for the chance to prove yourself?
I was not excited for the chance to prove myself. Anyone who's been through the difficulties that are associated with problems of this magnitude would have to be rather masochistic, I should think, to be excited to be involved. In fact, following the initial sense of fear and trepidation, I found myself fearing for the people in my command with whom we were unable to establish communications. But that quickly morphed once we were able to find out that they were fine. It quickly morphed into my own sense of self-doubt and a little bit of wonderment as to why I happen to be in this position. And so the short time of self-doubt and even maybe a little resentment quickly gave way to a sense of duty and responsibility and a feeling that I may be the best person to actually be able to affect an operation in response to something of this magnitude.
Why didn't you consider other options of collecting information? Would there be some way to collect information from the ground up from the Japanese through social media or something like that?
Clearly there were not in the first few days. We didn't have telephone or cell phone capability. The mainstream media in Japan, of course, is in Japanese. And so we made use of the Japanese workforce in a way that we hadn't had to use the Japanese workforce before. I used that for a couple of reasons. One is to redress the deficit of information, take advantage of the information that was available through the local national media, and to, frankly, incorporate the master labor contract workforce, the Japanese workforce, in a more robust way. Everyone in the Japanese workforce either knew somebody or knew somebody who knew someone who had been directly affected or likely to have been affected by what had transpired in the Tohoku region. And yet, there were some conflicting signs. So I decided, though, that I needed to investigate what I thought I might have discerned, this higher than normal level of anxiety. And I began a series of meetings with essentially all of our Japanese workforce members. And
Did you think about whether that was the right use of your time at this critical moment? Why not second in command do those meetings?
Right. Because I knew from my preparatory reading before I even got to Japan, what I understood about the Japanese culture led me to believe that the Japanese workforce would appreciate and admire the notion that the leader of the entity would take time to spend time with them. I just as clearly recognized that in time of crises, for the type of organization over which I presided, there needed to be decisions made very quickly, and I decided, rightly or wrongly, although in retrospect I think it was right, that centralizing the decisions in a crisis situation was apropos. And I felt that given the centrality of and the importance of the master labor contract workforce, that I needed to have a very intimate understanding of what their hopes and their worries, what their concerns were, what was the cause of the trepidation, and what we could do to reconcile those difficulties that they were facing.
So let's talk about the Anti-Deficiency Act. Now, I'm guessing someone who's been in your logistics role in the military as long as you've served knows that act and knows what it means. Is that right?
Yes, that's true. If I had any doubts about it, it was made clear to me when I was the U.S. Navy's representative to the State Department during the Haiti crisis, during the U.S. response to aid Haiti in the aftermath of their own severe earthquake. I clearly understood that there was a possibility that breaking the Anti-Deficiency Act could lead to personal prosecution.
And it's not a fantastical idea. You got advice from somebody in an informed position that it's a situation that deserves caution. Is that right?
It's only partially right. I would characterize it by more than just saying that I ought to be cautious. The advice that I received was from a Navy admiral who has some knowledge of logistics. And this particular admiral actually suggested that if he were in my shoes, he would cease humanitarian assistance, disaster relief efforts, so as to avoid the potential prosecution of the Anti-Deficiency Act.
Did you consider stopping the operation?
I did consider that for about a nanosecond. And it, I don't say that to be funny, but to emphasize that my expectation is that that admiral called me out of an abundance of concern for my own well-being. And I also recognize that that admiral really couldn't have understood the magnitude and the comprehensiveness, if you will, of the events that were unfolding. And so I essentially followed what I consider a moral imperative to save lives, which we were doing, and continued to do just that.
You made the commitments. You explained it as a moral imperative. That seems like a really critical moment. Give us some more insight into how you make that decision. I know you're someone who respects the law, respects the rules of the military. You couldn't have spent a career there if you didn't. So how do you decide when to operate in a way that doesn't seem to be specified by the rules?
Well, you can see I'm squirming in my seat at this question because it is an important one, and it was a defining moment. Although I said it only took a nanosecond for me to make the decision that I made it because I thought that the moral imperative essentially referred to maybe a higher law than a federal statute, which is enormously important in my life, but I thought that there was a higher moral law.
Let's step back and think of the operation as you were part of it in total. In what ways was it a success? In what ways do you wish things had gone differently or better?
Well, Paul, I feel very satisfied that we succeeded as well as we could, given a couple of institutional problems that existed at the time. In fact, I'm very proud of what we were able to do. I thought that our military personnel, I thought that our American civil servants, and perhaps most notably our Japanese workforce, our master labor contract workforce, did beautifully.
Let's think about you as a leader. What did you learn?
Well, either I learned or confirmed some things that I thought I knew before, but feel more certain about now, and that is the importance of, probably number one, really understanding my own value system. It became very evident to me that that was crucial when facing the dilemmas that accompany the decision-making in an event like this. The second point that I learned as a leader of a large organization facing complex operations is the value of simplification. And so worked very hard to ensure that we used the heuristics to maintain focus on mission while still providing the nuanced detail to affect the mission appropriately. And then thirdly, I recognized that people in organizations want to be a part of the good things that that organization can do. It is imperative for any leader to recognize the capabilities that surround that leader. It's part of being humble. And to utilize them to the maximum extent possible.
Know your values, simplify in the face of complexity, and that people want to be part of something bigger, and the implications of that as a leader is you have to make space for them and allow them to make the most of their efforts as a collective.
That's absolutely right.
Matt, thanks so much.
Thank you.